The dust followed the wagon like a shroud, a pale ghost clinging to the slow turn of the wheels. Elias watched from the porch of his homestead, a place carved out of the unforgiving plains with little more than sweat and silence. He stood unmoving, a figure etched against the bleached wood of his house, his face a landscape of its own, weathered by a sun and a sorrow that were equally relentless. The wagon stopped. The man driving it, Silas, had a face like a fist, tight and bruised with greed. He didn't get down. He just spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Debts paid," Silas grunted, his voice a gravelly tear in the fabric of the quiet. He gestured with his chin toward the back of the wagon. Elias's eyes shifted. A woman, Ilara, sat on the rough-hewn planks, her spine so straight it seemed it might snap. Her hands were clenched in the worn fabric of her dress, knuckles white. Beside her, a small boy, no older than 6, stared out with eyes that held nothing. Not fear, not curiosity, just a profound and terrible emptiness. Fin. Silas had mentioned the boy was part of the bargain. Elias said nothing. His gaze was a weight, pressing down on the scene, measuring it. Silas grew impatient under the scrutiny. 2 goats and the colt you wanted, for her and the whelp, were square. He shoved a leather-wrapped revolver toward Elias, the metal glinting dully. He didn't wait for a response. With a sharp crack of the reins, Silas turned the wagon and rumbled away, leaving the woman and the boy behind in the rising dust, abandoned islands in a sea of dirt. Ilara did not move. She watched the wagon shrink into the horizon until it was gone, her expression unreadable. The boy remained a statue of hollowed-out childhood. The wind whispered across the plains, a lonely sound that found purchase in the loose boards of the barn and the brittle leaves of the solitary cottonwood. Elias finally moved, his boots scuffing softly on the porch steps. He didn't approach them directly. He walked to the water pump, the rhythmic creak and groan of the handle a stark, mechanical heartbeat in the silence. He filled a dipper and set it on the edge of the horse trough, then retreated to his porch, leaving the offering between them. He sat on the top step, his back to the door, and began to clean the revolver Silas had given him, the methodical clicks of the cylinder a form of communication he understood. Hours passed. The sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple. The temperature began to drop. Finally, Ilara slid from the wagon bed, her movements stiff. She helped the boy down, his small body pliant and unnervingly light. She walked not to the house, but to the dipper of water. She gave the first drink to the boy, who took it without expression. Then she drank, her throat working, her eyes scanning the homestead, taking in the small, tidy cabin, the sturdy barn, the neatly mended fences, and the 2 simple wooden crosses on a low hill overlooking it all. Elias watched her gaze settle on the graves. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He had buried his wife and daughter there, taken by the fever 3 winters ago. He had buried his voice with them, burying it under layers of stoic duty. He gestured with his head toward a small, detached bunkhouse, a clean, Spartan room he used for storage. "There," he said. The single word was rough and used. Ilara nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. She took the boy's hand and led him inside. She did not light the lamp. Elias saw their silhouettes against the window, 2 shapes of darkness against the growing dark outside. He finished cleaning the gun, its cold weight a familiar burden in his hand. He went inside his own house, the scent of wood smoke and solitude clinging to the air. He made a simple stew, the quiet chop of vegetables and the simmer of the pot filling the space his family used to occupy. He ate his portion standing by the stove. He ladled the rest into 2 bowls and carried them out, leaving them on the bunkhouse step before retreating back into his own lonely warmth. The next morning, the bowls were empty on the step. He saw no sign of them. He went about his chores, the rhythm of the work a prayer he no longer knew how to speak. He mucked out the stable, repaired a harness, chopped wood. The sun was high when he saw the boy, Finn, standing in the doorway of the bunkhouse, a small sentinel in the vast emptiness. He was watching Elias split logs, the axe rising and falling with brutal efficiency. Elias didn't acknowledge him at first. He just kept working, the sharp crack of splitting with the only sound. After a time, he set the axe aside. He picked up a small piece of kindling and took a knife from his belt. He sat on the woodpile and began to whittle, long, practiced strokes peeling away the bark, revealing the pale wood beneath. He didn't look at the boy, but he was aware of every shift in his weight, every silent breath. Finn took a hesitant step out of the doorway. Then another. He crept closer, his empty eyes fixed on the sliver of wood taking shape in Elias's hands. It was a bird, crude and simple, but recognizable. Elias worked the knife, shaving off a curl of wood to form a wing. He set the unfinished carving on the log beside him and went back to the water pump. When he returned, the carving was gone. The boy was back in the bunkhouse doorway, his small hands hidden behind his back. It was the first exchange. A silent transaction of trust, more valuable than any revolver. That evening, Elara emerged. She picked up the empty bowls from the step and, instead of leaving them, she carried them to the water pump. She washed them meticulously, her movements economical and precise. She set them clean back on the step. It was her reply. Quiet thank you. A recognition of his humanity. Days bled into one another. The routine became their language. Elias would work. Elara would watch. He would leave food. She would return the clean bowls. The boy, Finn, would sometimes appear, a shadow at the edge of Elias's vision, always holding the small wooden bird. Elias learned the map of Elara's trauma without her ever speaking a word of it. He saw it in the way she flinched if he moved too quickly, the way she herded Finn behind her if a horse made a sudden noise, the way she stared at the horizon as if expecting an enemy to appear at any moment. He saw the faint, faded scar that traced the line of her jaw, a pale white crescent in the sun. He never asked. The questions were a violation he would not permit on this land. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise. The wind picked up, howling a mournful song through the plains grass. A storm was coming, a bad one. Elias looked at the bunkhouse, its thin walls no match for the fury that was about to be unleashed. He walked over, the wind tearing at his coat. He knocked on the door, a courtesy he hadn't offered before. Elara opened it. Her hair was loose, whipped across her face by the wind. She held Finn's hand tightly. The house, Elias said, shouting over the rising gale. It's safer, she hesitated for only a second, her eyes searching his. She saw no threat there, only a grim practicality. She nodded and followed him, shielding Finn with her body as they crossed the yard. Inside, the storm's rage was muted to a dull roar. Elias built up the fire in the hearth, the flames leaping up, casting flickering, warm shadows across the room. He handed her a thick wool blanket. She wrapped it around the boy, then around herself. They sat on the floor near the hearth, not close to him, but within the circle of the fire's light and warmth. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was a shared silence, a fortress against the screaming wind outside. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her, not as part of a debt, but as a person huddled in his home. He saw the exhaustion etched deep into her face, the tremor in her hands that the blanket couldn't still. He thought of the 2 graves on the hill. He thought of promises broken by sickness and fate. He stood up and walked to the hook by the door where his hat hung. It was a plainsman's hat, stained with sweat and dust, shaped by wind and rain. It was a part of him. He walked back and placed it on the small table between them. A simple, profound offering. A symbol of shelter. Elara stared at it. Silas, she said, her voice a raw, cracked whisper. It was the first time she had spoken his name. It was the first time she had spoken to Elias at all. He won't stop. Elias's gaze was steady, meeting hers across the firelight. This is my land, he said, his voice low but resonant. No one will take you from this land. That is my promise. Her shoulders slumped, a fraction of the immense weight she carried sliding off. She looked from his face to the hat, a silent acceptance of the vow. For the first time since she had arrived, the terror in her eyes receded, replaced by a flicker of something fragile and tentative. Hope. The storm passed, and with it came a delicate peace. Alara began to venture out more. She started a small garden in a patch of earth Elias tilled for her. She hung laundry on a line, the white sheets brilliant flags of domesticity against the brown landscape. Finn would follow her, the wooden bird always in his pocket. He still hadn't spoken, but his eyes had started to see again. They would watch Elias mend the fence that bordered the property. The rhythmic hammer blows a sound of permanence, of rebuilding. One morning, Alara brought him a cup of coffee as he worked. She just held it out. He took it, their fingers brushing for a moment. Her hand was calloused, but warm. The contact was electric, a jolt of life in his dormant world. He looked at her, at the way the morning sun caught the gold in her hair, and he felt a thawing in the frozen landscape of his heart. They had built a life from the scraps of their broken ones, a fragile mosaic of shared chores and silent understanding. But the plains were honest. They never let you forget that peace was temporary. It was Finn who saw him first. The boy stopped playing and stood rigid, staring at the horizon. A lone rider moving fast. Alara followed his gaze, and all the color drained from her face. The fragile piece shattered like glass. It was Silas. Elias saw it too. He put down his hammer and walked back toward the house, his movements calm, deliberate. He told Alara to take the boy inside and lock the door. He took the rifle from its pegs over the mantelpiece. He went back to the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, and waited. Silas rode into the yard, pulling his horse up so hard it reared. He had another man with him, a hard case with dead eyes and a pistol strapped to his hip. Silas's face was a mask of smug contempt. "Morning, Elias," he sneered. "Come to collect my property." Elias didn't move. "The debt is paid, Silas." "You said so yourself." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Plans change. Turns out a man down in Three Forks is willing to pay a hell of a lot more for a woman with her spirit. And the boy, too. Said he needs a new field hand," he spat. "2 goats and a rusty colt. I was feeling generous that day. Now I'm not." The words hung in the air, brutal and raw, exposing the full degradation of the transaction. Alara, watching from the window, flinched as if struck. "She's not property," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you're not setting foot in my house." "That's where you're wrong," Silas said, swinging down from his horse. The other man dismounted, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. "I'm taking what's mine." As Silas took a step toward the porch, Elias raised the rifle. The motion was fluid, economical. "The promise was made," Elias stated, his eyes locked on Silas. On this land, Silas hesitated, seeing the unwavering resolve in Elias's face. It was the face of a man who had lost everything once and would die before he lost it again. Silas's greed outweighed his caution. He lunged for the steps. The rifle cracked, the sound shockingly loud in the still air. Silas stumbled back, a dark blossom of red spreading across his chest. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief, then pitched forward into the dust he was so fond of. The other man, stunned for a fraction of a second, clawed for his pistol. Elias worked the lever of the rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new one in a single practiced motion. The second shot was just as precise. The hard case crumpled to the ground without a sound. Silence descended again, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Elias stood for a long moment, the rifle still hot in his hands. He was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the violence he had unleashed, a beast he had kept caged for years. The front door creaked open. Alara came out, her face pale but her eyes clear. She walked down the steps and looked at the bodies, then at Elias. He had a shallow gash on his forearm where a splinter from the porch rail had cut him. Without a word, she went back inside and returned with a strip of clean cloth and a bowl of water. She stood before him and gently took his arm. She cleaned the wound, her touch steady and sure. It was not the touch of a victim, but of a partner. A healer. As she tied the bandage, a small sound made them both look up. Finn was standing in the doorway. He looked at the bodies in the dirt, then at the two of them standing together. He walked slowly toward Elias, his small face a mixture of awe and fear. He reached out a tiny hand and laid it on Elias's bandaged arm. "Elias," he said. The word was a tiny, perfect miracle. It was the first word he had spoken, the first sound they had ever heard him make. Elias felt the foundation of his world shift. He looked down at the boy, then at Alara. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. A real smile, one that reached her eyes and transformed her face. Sometime later, after the grim work was done, after the scars on the land were covered over, a new quiet settled on the homestead. It wasn't the quiet of absence or loneliness, but of peace. Elias was at the fence line, hammering a new post into the ground. The late afternoon sun was warm on his back. Alara was nearby, weeding her small, thriving garden. Finn was sitting in the grass, carefully arranging pebbles around the small wooden bird. Elias finished his work and walked over to them. He looked at the family he had never expected, a family forged in a crucible of violence and pain. He looked at Alara, her hands in the dirt, bringing forth life from the barren ground. He reached up, took off his hat, and gently placed it on her head. It was too big, and it slid down over her eyes. She pushed it back, laughing softly, and looked up at him. The sun caught in her hair, a halo of gold under the brim of his hat. He felt a smile crack the dry earth of his own face. It was a small, unfamiliar thing, but it was real. They stood there together, the man, the woman, and the boy, three solitary figures no longer alone, rooted in the land that had taken so much and had, at last, given something back. Promise kept. A family found.